December 16th, 1944, deep inside the Ardennes Forest. For the German soldiers of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, this was supposed to be a day of triumph. They were the tip of Hitler's final spear, the army chosen to smash the quiet American front and drive straight to the sea. The air was heavy with fog and the scent of pine, and the ground trembled beneath the roar of tanks. These men were veterans, hardened by the Eastern Front, by years of blood, mud, and fire. They knew the sound of battle like the rhythm of their own hearts. They knew the whistle of an incoming shell, the thud of an explosion, the shape of a crater that could save your life if you dove fast enough. War had rules, brutal, terrifying rules, but still rules. Until that morning, when the rules broke, the American artillery began to answer their assault, and the familiar scream of shells filled the air. But then nothing. No impacts, no eruptions of earth, just a sharp crack overhead, and then came the rain. A storm of steel fragments poured down from the sky, shredding trees, uniforms, and flesh alike. It didn't matter if you were undercover or buried in a foxhole. Death was falling from above. Veterans who had survived Stalingrad now screamed that the Americans had summoned demons. To them, it wasn't artillery. It was sorcery. It was as if every shell could see them and chose the perfect moment to strike. What the German soldiers didn't know was that they were witnessing the battlefield debut of one of the most extraordinary inventions of the war, a weapon that scientists had once called impossible. The shells that tore through the forest were not ordinary artillery rounds. They were marked with two simple letters, VT, short for variable time. Inside their noses hid a secret so advanced that even Germany's best physicists believed it could never work. Each shell contained a miniature radar, a tiny transmitter and receiver packed into a space, no larger than a coffee cup. As the shell flew, it sent out invisible radio waves ahead of it. When those waves bounced back from a solid object, a tree, a tank, a human body, the fuse felt the echo and detonated at the perfect height. For the first time in history, a shell didn't need to hit its target. It only needed to get close. This small shift, a matter of a few feet, multiplied its lethality by 50. No human calculation, no stopwatch, no mechanical timer could ever match it. It was, in every sense, a thinking weapon. And yet, this miracle almost never happened. Even American scientists had once laughed at the idea. The physics seemed absurd. How could a delicate radio survive the monstrous violence of a cannon's launch? 20,000 Gs of force, enough to crush steel, enough to turn a human body into pulp. But in a small, disguised garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, a handful of scientists from Johns Hopkins University were about to prove the impossible. The mission sounded absurd. Build a radar small enough to fit inside a shell, tough enough to survive being fired from a cannon, and smart enough to know when to explode. The scientists at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab didn't work in marble halls or secret mountain bunkers. Their laboratory was a converted car dealership, with paint peeling off the walls, and for sale signs still hanging outside. Inside, some of America's brightest physicists worked in total secrecy, under orders so classified that even their wives didn't know what they were building. At its peak, the project employed 3% of all physicists in the United States. Yet every single one of them was trying to solve the same impossible problem: how to build a brain inside a bullet. The early tests were disasters. They packed prototypes into shells, fired them, and recovered nothing but twisted metal and shards of glass. The vacuum tubes shattered every time. The radio circuits melted from the heat. The batteries failed under pressure. The laws of physics seemed to mock them. Every shot ended the same way: failure. But the team refused to give up. They tried rubber insulation, wax padding, and steel reinforcement around the filaments. One young physicist, James Van Allen, would later become famous for discovering Earth's radiation belts. Here, in 1942, he was building tiny vacuum tubes no bigger than a pencil eraser. Small, rugged, nearly indestructible. The breakthrough came with a sound. Crack. The tube survived its first firing. It had worked. A whisper of radio signal bounced back from the frozen ground below, and for the first time, the shell knew where it was. They had done it. They had given sight to steel. By December 1944, the proximity fuse was ready, tested, perfected, and feared even by those who built it. For months, it had been used only at sea, where the danger of a dud being recovered by the enemy was minimal. Over land, it was forbidden. If even one unexploded shell fell into German hands, they could reverse engineer it and turn it against Allied bombers. The order from high command was clear: never use VT fuses on land. But in the Ardennes, orders were becoming meaningless. Colonel Oscar Axelson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group, watched his front collapse near the town of Monschau. The thin line of the 38th Cavalry Squadron was being swallowed by the German advance. The fog was thick, radio lines were breaking, and his guns were running out of time. He had two choices: follow orders and lose everything, or disobey and change history. Axelson looked at the crates stacked beside his position. Each shell inside was stamped with two letters, VT. He had been told these were too valuable to risk. Now, they were his only chance. He made his decision. "Load the VT rounds," he said quietly. The gun crews hesitated. They knew the order was illegal, but they obeyed. Moments later, the forest erupted. The first shells screamed overhead, then exploded in perfect synchronization above the German lines. Not in the ground, not a second too early or too late, but exactly where they would kill the most. The effect was immediate. The German advance didn't just slow, it stopped. Axelson had just unleashed the second most important secret weapon of the entire war. The German troops, advancing through the snow, didn't know what hit them. The sky itself seemed to have turned into a weapon. There were no warning blasts, no geysers of dirt, no craters to dive into. The explosions came from above, perfect, even, merciless. Each shell burst 30 feet off the ground, spraying molten steel downward in a cone of death. The air was filled with shrieking metal. Foxholes became coffins. Tree trunks offered no protection. Every soldier who moved, every squad that tried to regroup, was shredded by invisible rain. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, low on food, fuel, and hope. But what they had was artillery, and now they had the proximity fuse. When the Germans began their massive infantry assaults across the white fields surrounding the town, the American guns opened fire. Shells screamed through the icy air and detonated not in the ground, but in the clouds above. The snow turned black. Entire platoons vanished in seconds. There was no safe place. The sky was alive, and it hated them. Captured German soldiers babbled in shock. They said the American shells could see, that they exploded when they wanted to. They called it ghost fire. One prisoner wept as he whispered, "It came from the air. It saw us hiding. It chose who died." By the end of the day, the German advance around Bastogne had collapsed. Technology, not numbers, had saved the 101st. Christmas night, 1944. Near the frozen Sour River, a German battalion was preparing to cross under the cover of fog. The air was silent, thick with cold mist and confidence. They believed the darkness protected them. No American spotter could see through this veil. They would be across before dawn. The war for this moment seemed to favor them. But across the river, American artillerymen were waiting. Their guns were loaded with the new VT fuses, the shells that didn't need to see. They only needed to sense. At exactly 2:30 a.m., Colonel Patton's forward observers detected movement on the river. He gave the order, "Fire." Hundreds of shells streaked into the fog. They didn't hit the water. They exploded above it. Each shell's tiny radar sensed the surface of the river below, and the soldiers crossing it. The fuses triggered perfectly. The sky flashed white. The water turned red. The fog lit up like a sunrise made of fire and metal. Men screamed, fell, and vanished into the churning, boiling current. When morning came, American patrols moved in. What they saw defied comprehension. Bodies tangled in ice and barbed wire. Weapons melted into the riverbanks. Patton wrote in his diary that day, "When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies. An entire battalion gone." This wasn't a battle. It was an erasure. The proximity fuse had turned nature itself, fog, water, and air, into a weapon. The Germans had always trusted the forest. In the Ardennes, it had saved them before. Dense, dark, ancient, a perfect shield from Allied planes and observation posts. Among the trees, they could move unseen, regroup, ambush, and survive. But now, the forest was betraying them. The Americans had learned something new. In denser woods, the proximity fuse was even deadlier. When a shell burst above the treetops, its fragments tore through the branches, splintering them into thousands of wooden daggers. The air filled not only with steel, but with wood, sharp, fast, unstoppable. Men who took cover behind oaks were impaled by splinters thicker than fingers. Foxholes became traps. Even the earth couldn't save them. Shrapnel and debris came from every direction. One German officer later said, "The forest turned against us. It rained wood and fire." American gunners quickly adapted. They didn't aim for the ground anymore. They aimed for the canopy. A single shell could clear an area the size of a tennis court, ripping apart everything beneath. Entire squads vanished without a sound. The Ardennes, once a refuge, had become a living nightmare. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, German troops captured an American ammunition depot, a treasure trove of supplies, fuel, guns, and tens of thousands of artillery shells. Among the crates, they found boxes stamped with strange markings. VT, variable time. To German intelligence, this was a gift from heaven. They rushed the fuses to their top scientists in Berlin. What those scientists found inside should have changed the course of the war. Tiny radio tubes, delicate wiring, a battery that seemed to activate itself when fired. It was something no one in Germany had ever seen before. For hours they examined it, then issued their official report. "This is impossible." They concluded it must be a trick, a decoy to confuse their engineers. They believed a vacuum tube could never survive. The shock of being fired from a cannon. To them, the Americans had simply built a fake weapon to mislead them. They threw the captured fuses into storage, unaware they were holding the key to stopping the slaughter of their own men. The truth was more tragic than they knew. Before the war, German companies like Rheinmetall had worked on proximity fuse designs. They had prototypes, functional ones. But in 1940, Hitler himself ordered the project canceled. He wanted weapons ready in 6 months, not 6 years, so the program died, buried under arrogance and impatience. Now, as shells exploded over the Ardennes, Germany was paying the price for its disbelief in the impossible. While the German front crumbled in the snow, a different kind of army was at war in America. An army without uniforms, without rifles, fighting with soldering irons and microscopes. They were the workers of the VT Fuse program. Over 100 factories, spread across the United States, worked in absolute secrecy. Crosley Corporation, once known for radios and refrigerators, was now building death precision-engineered fuses, smaller than a man's fist. At RCA, General Electric, and Sylvania, the best engineers in the country, had abandoned consumer electronics to create something the world had never seen. Inside the factories, security was so tight that even the workers didn't know what they were making. One woman would assemble tiny glass tubes all day. Another would wire minuscule circuits. None of them saw the final product. They just knew it mattered. One factory sign read, "Your hands are building something that will save your brother's lives." By late 1944, American industry was producing one proximity fuse every 2 seconds, around the clock. The cost dropped from $732 per unit to just $18. Every part was hand-tested, every joint inspected under microscopes. If 1 in 1,000 failed, it was destroyed. Nothing less than perfection was accepted. And behind this miracle of precision stood the quiet strength of women, mothers, daughters, wives, who worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, never knowing that their delicate fingers were crafting one of the most decisive weapons of the war. They weren't on the front lines, but they were winning the war, one circuit at a time. January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was ending. The last great gamble of the Third Reich had failed. German armies were retreating, leaving behind burned vehicles, frozen bodies, and the shattered myth of technological superiority. In their war diaries, German commanders wrote of an artillery that seemed to have eyes. They said the sky itself had become the enemy. Field Marshal von Rundstedt confessed, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down because of artillery that could see." He wasn't wrong. By the end of the battle, more than 200,000 proximity fused shells had been fired across the Ardennes. They accounted for over half of German casualties in several major sectors. It wasn't courage that turned the tide. It was circuitry. In the aftermath, scientists began to realize what they had truly created. The VT fuse was more than a weapon. It was the birth of intelligent warfare. For the first time in history, a machine could sense its environment and make a decision. From that principle came the entire lineage of modern technology: guided missiles, radar, microchips, and the digital logic that would shape the next century. The tiny vacuum tubes that once pulsed inside artillery shells would evolve into transistors and eventually into the computer you're watching this on. Dr. James Van Allen, the physicist who built the fuse's hardened vacuum tubes, later designed the instruments that discovered Earth's radiation belts. He once said quietly, "It started with the war. We learned how to make machines survive violence." The proximity fuse was second only to the atomic bomb in its impact on the outcome of World War II. But unlike the bomb, it didn't destroy cities. It reshaped the logic of war itself. The German soldiers who died in the Ardennes were not just casualties of combat. They were the first victims of a new kind of warfare, where victory belonged not to bravery or chance, but to science. And in that snow-covered forest, the modern age was born, forged not by fire, but by the relentless mind of man.